this is Dylan Moore with Irida TV, and I have Herr here from the Center for Self-Governance to talk some systematic politics, which is a favorite conversation that we have on this show if you've watched it for any amount of time. And Center for Self-Governance, Herr in particular, does trainings on how to start thinking systematically when it comes to politics. And we're going to be talking about some, I don't know if maybe higher level is the right way to describe it. It's maybe the better way to describe it is as we start to remove our ego from the conversation of politics, and we stop seeing the football drama of political parties and elections. We start stepping back from that. What sort of landscape do we start seeing? So first off, Mark, thanks for taking the time to come on and having a conversation like this, because I know you are freaking busy.
I just appreciate spending time with you, Dylan. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So real quick, before we get into details, for a lot of people who've maybe just heard systematic politics for the first time, they have no idea what we're talking about. Can you give a brief description of systematic versus partisan politics so people know what planet we're on in terms of this conversation?
Sure. Our basic human nature is survival and influence, and so we'll gather in tribes based on issues that affect us the most. That's partisan politics. Systematic politics is the system of managing our relationships with words. And so we advocate for or against certain structures of government that we define in our society, our community. For example, a school, city, a county, a state, a nation. And so systematic politics is the advocacy for or against a certain structure of government.
So a metaphor that you've given before is that of an airplane, right? Partisan politics could be described as the people riding the airplane voting on who's going to fly the airplane, meaning where's the airplane going to go? Versus systematic politics is saying, well, who's making sure that the airplane is still functioning the way the airplane's supposed to function? Because if we take this metaphor one step further and say, well, if the airplane malfunctions in the air, it doesn't matter who's flying it because it's going to fall and crash, right? If we have just like maybe a more specific example, and when like for example, protest. And I mean, I don't even want to get into the crazy stuff that's happening on university campuses right now. But I mean, let's say some law is getting passed or whatever that's taking away the right of something, or the public perceives it as it's taking away the right to X. And they go out in the street and they start protesting and jumping up and down and waving signs and flipping off cameras and all that sort of thing. That's more of the partisan side, like you just said, right? Where it's like, okay, we're tribal. We understand survival, and we want to fight for that survival. So we see this input, which is somebody's taking away one of my abilities to survive. I'm going to go forward and resist that. However, that resistance may not actually be that effective at achieving what you wanted to achieve, because you're not addressing the underlying system of how the system actually operates beneath it. I mean, am I correct me or not? Am I getting kind of close to a way of describing systematic versus partisan?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great metaphor. You're 35,000 feet above the ground, and government is essentially the plane holding you all together in a community. You've got the people managing the plane. You've got the people in the different classes: first, business, economy, bathrooms, who gets to use, who can stand up, services, what all the regulations, what you can and can't do. It's just a good metaphor for society in general. You're sitting next to someone you don't even know. Do you strike up a conversation? What do you do? I mean, it's just like society. So it's just a good metaphor. Partisan politics inside the plane would be hijacker took over the cockpit. Now, what do you do? Survival instinct. And so you tribalize, you gather together with people who want to storm the cockpit, people who just want to sit back and do nothing. You know what I mean? And so that's inside the plane. Systematic politics is, what do I do before I storm the cockpit? Do I understand the system, and can I disrupt the control of that hijacker before I storm the cockpit with the partisans? The partisans are going to react instinctively. It'll be a survival instinct based on the influence. Usually right makes right, or strength in numbers, those kind of things happen. So we talk about populism and elections and all this stuff in the day-to-day media kind of conversations about partisan politics. But what we teach our students at Center for Self-Governance is to step back and look at the plane, the system first, before storming the cockpit. There are easily, if your plane is hijacked, by the way, there's easily 4 options before you storm the cockpit. And most of the people, their survival instinct, they're not going to be able to hear you, so they'll storm the cockpit and waste the 4 options. So I recommend learning the system first, no matter what you do. Even if you're going to remain a partisan, which I don't recommend because it's life-sucking, soul-sucking, time-sucking, days of our lives soap opera. It literally restricts your ability to see the other options before you storm that cockpit. And if you're trying to survive, it's just a huge mistake, especially if you're 35,000 feet, right? You want to make sure that if you have at least somebody in your group that knows how the system works, are there any options before we storm that cockpit? Because as soon as we do and that hijacker realizes it and they push the pedal forward and the plane nosedives toward the ground, you could end up a big pile of ashes in a Pennsylvania field in 2001.
Even though what you're doing was right. You were doing the
right.
righteous thing.
It's a survival. Right? Yeah, it's a survival instinct. Sure, we need to take this plane back, buddy. We need to take America back. Well, just all I can say is with systematic politics, it's a different mindset because you see the whole system outside of your survival instincts. That requires self-governance. And then number 2, once you see the system, you start to identify all the additional options that enable you to be more successful in fixing, modifying, controlling that plane so it doesn't crash into a field of flames and death.
So instead of saying, oh my God, I need this person to be the president. Oh my God, I need this person to be the governor. Oh my God, I need the Republicans to get control of the House again. Or, oh my God, I need to make sure the Republicans don't get control of the House or Senate. Yeah, Republicans theoretically have control of the House right now. Whatever it is, that's kind of the survival, tribalistic, partisan politics, of what's going on. But you're saying, okay, if we take a couple of steps back, and and not that that's not a real thing, and not that that's not important. Like there's real ramifications of those things.
The key is survival instincts, Dylan. It's survival instincts. That's the key. Self-governance isn't just about doing what I want to do for myself, which I agree, leave you alone, leave me alone. I get all that philosophical stuff. But there is a concept in the mind where you govern the self first before reacting to a survival instinct. Mm-hmm. And so there's a practical metaphor besides a plane, and that is like in the military, you have the grunts who are trained in basic training to go fight the war, and they're sent off to die. And then there are the grunts who are trained at a higher level to deny their survival instincts. And the results are, when they get past that survival instinct, they're able to accomplish more than a 5,000-man army with incredibly lower number of human resources and financial resources and physical hardware resources. Usually between 12 and 28 people can do the same work as 5,000, just training their survival instincts, governing those instincts. That's the key. We're asking people to learn how to govern their survival instincts before they storm the cockpit, not just for the instinct of we have a hijacker in the name of Donald Trump or Joe Biden, so we have to storm the cockpit and replace them. And somehow
we got it, and everything's going to be fixed, right?
And pilots don't fix planes. Pilots operate; they steer them. And so that's kind of the second piece here is, with a survival instinct governed and a systematic knowledge how things actually work in our government system, whether I like it or not, how is it actually working? My options increase exponentially. And my options are, most people become, when they become optionless, like a cornered tiger, the only thing they have is to strike out. And you can see that today with the college campuses and January 6th and all that stuff. It's just literally human nature expressing itself with a lack of self-governance.
And then in terms of, if we could draw two broad strokes here, there's a team of very, very wealthy and very, very connected and very, very backward and forward thinking people that understand how the system works and want to guide it in a certain direction, which isn't necessarily in my benefit or your benefit, versus the other side that say, okay, theoretically what you're trying to train is recognize that system and say, how do we steer this in our benefit, right?
Yes.
And the people who, the rich, wealthy people who are understanding the system very clearly understand our human nature, and they know, hey, if we do this, this survival instinct is going to pop up.
Yep. It's kind of
And
like
we know how to deal with that. We have a playbook in place to deal with that, right?
the perfect example is parenting. You've got a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, you know they're going to poop themselves, and you know that they're going to knock things over, and they're going to, you know what I mean? They're going to stick their finger in because they don't know consequence. And I would say at the adult level in politics, it's like that. The people you're describing feel like they're kind of the parents and we are the children, and they know how we're going to react. But it's just at the adult level. There's just that kind of metaphoric relationship there where they see themselves as parents, us as the children. They know how we're going to react, and they simply either exploit it or press the buttons. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you take a step back and you say, okay, I'm not looking at this partisan politic soap opera thing. You take a step back and you say, okay, here's the system. What are the most important things that you see in either A, maintaining the system, or B, directing it in a place that's good for us, the in quotes children, as opposed to the really horribly evil adults?
Well, first I would say history is a good indicator of future results. So in American history, we tend to focus on traditional things related to patriotism and stuff, which I don't disagree with. But I would say there is a gold thread in history that is most assuredly worth paying attention to, and that is the Quaker abolition movement in the 1600s that is part of the creation of the United States in the 1700s, particularly in Philadelphia, and the 1900s, which would be 1801 to the 1860s before the Civil War, and the shaping of the abolition movement and the partisan party movement, how they overlap each other and they meet at the Civil War in 1860. That abolition movement and the partisan party movement that begins in 1802 or 1801 with Jefferson and Adams, those two movements are worth studying and understanding as they converge at the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, there is a split within the abolition movement that takes place that is incredibly important as it relates to what we're experiencing in our 21st century lifetimes. That split in the abolition movement and a convergence that takes place within the partisan party movement in the late 1890s through the 1920s is incredibly important history in relationship to what's going on with our system in the 21st century. And then a third component is a political scientist named Charles Merriam, who understood the history that I'm outlining very, very briefly, the abolition history, the partisan history, post-Civil War history related to abolition and partisanship, and the emergence of a new philosophy called progressivism. And progressivism merged abolition, partisan politics, science, and bureaucratic management together in the late 1920s. And in something that's called the New Deal under Roosevelt, most people will study Roosevelt and quote him and stuff. But again, I'm giving you kind of the undercurrent of history that's not covered so well. We covered all the presidents and all the big things, right? But abolition, partisan politics, post-Civil War abolition and partisan politics, the emergence of progressivism, and this gentleman named Charles Merriam, who becomes the official advisor to FDR during the New Deal. Behind the scenes, he's fine with ambiguity, or, you know what I mean, behind the scenes. He's anonymous.
He doesn't need to be in the limelight.
He didn't need to be in the limelight, but he was the structural engineer. He was let's say, he was the Einstein who created the nuclear bomb to destroy the United States system of government.
Mm-hmm.
Incrementally, gradually, through attrition, not through bloodshed or revolution, like the abolitionists wanted to do during the Civil War. Merriam figured out how to marry political science and activism. He figured out how to marry science with public administrative bureaucrats under a cloak of nonpartisanship.
And then one important part I want to throw in here is Charles Merriam was actually the guy that came up with behavioral psychology, correct?
Well, he came up with political science version of behavioralism.
Okay.
Under the idea that you study human nature. You don't study what Biden should do. You study what he's going to do.
Mm.
Okay, so this is the contrast.
Then you can give him stimuli to direct him. Yeah.
Yes, and he created the mazes for that, where Biden and the bureaucrats would run around, and Merriam created the marriage between science and bureaucracy under the cloak of nonpartisan. But this is kind of the crux of the matter is that Merriam he created the National Progressive Party in 1912. He wrote the platform for it. He ran for Republican alderman many times in Chicago, and he ran as an independent many times in Chicago between 1905 and 1919. He convinced the progressive movement, stop practicing partisan politics. We will marry science and bureaucracy together under a cloak of non-political, unbiased, nonpartisan technicalities.
Unbiased, yes. Uh-huh.
Yes. And he was then installed in the president's White House in something called the Executive Office of the President in 1939. And that is where we can see the technical modification of our system of government beginning. So the infrastructure in the 1920s, the partisan exploration, experimentation laboratory, 1900s through 1919, his education in college, Columbia, funded by the Rockefellers, that kind of stuff in the 1880s, 1890s, the rise of the progressive era. And by 1933 through 1953, the last 20 years of his life, he's not in the cockpit. Roosevelt's in the cockpit. Merriam is in the baggage compartment rewiring the wiring harnesses. And so while everyone's storming the cockpit to replace the evil hijacker, no one's paying attention to the guy rewiring the damn plane. And so anyway, we've discovered Merriam the Anonymous, who was put and installed into the Executive Office of the President by Roosevelt during the New Deal to plant the seeds of new infrastructure to modify our system of government under the cloak of nonpartisanship, but it's actually a cloak that hides the Progressive Party platform of 1912.
I want to dive into two things that you just brought up there. But first, can you turn your phone sound down? Every time you get a text message, it's coming through pretty loud.
I thought I had it down. There we go.
So you mentioned the abolitionist movement, the progressive, the abolitionist movement, and then you mentioned this Charles Merriam progressiveness, and if I remember my history correctly and the training I've received from you correctly, first off, the abolitionist movement on one hand is a good thing because they're saying get rid of slavery, right? But on the other hand, they're saying, well, slavery is a result of the fact that we have, that there's not enough federal control and all these states have this too much power and they're able to break away and we're not able to control them. So we need to completely revamp how our government works so we can never get into a situation again where these states over here can tell the guy up top no. So far, am I roughly accurate?
Yeah, I mean,
roughly.
basically.
One more point to that, and then they were very open about it, and in the sense of let's be out in the open and make an up top decision in order to enforce that.
Essentially, progressives are not abolitionists. Abolitionists are free the slaves.
Right.
Progressives are eugenic supremacists who believe in pure aristocracy.
Okay.
Now, there's a marriage between them because they have a common objective. And for the abolitionists, they want to burn down the system. For the progressives, they want to change it. But they share the same idea of this system is bad and it needs to either be destroyed or changed. Progressives would prefer to change it over time. Abolitionists would prefer to destroy it in one, like you can see on the college campuses right now, fight each other, shoot each other, stab each other, bloodshed, get it over with. Progressives prefer long game. They believe in eugenic supremacy, so they are not anti-racist. They're actually racist, and they don't believe in. They say the word democracy. What they mean is an aristocracy in Plato's Republic that makes the decisions for all the selfish people. The girl who wants the abortion and the Christian who doesn't want the abortion. They're okay with both of them fighting each other because that would be a selfish conflict. They see themselves above that, and they would make, rather than us, they would let us have our elections and our voice in public comment. But in their world, science married to bureaucrats. Bureaucrats are not elected. Scientists are not elected, but they consider themselves to be objective truth seekers, unbiased enforcers, right? So the scientists are kind of like the guardian philosopher kings of Plato's Republic, where they make the rules. Mm-hmm. And the bureaucrats are the guardians who enforce the rules. And all of that is done selflessly according to their definitions.
Selflessly, yes.
According to their definitions of things. And so Merriam just merely figured out how to assemble that infrastructure. He was given the authority by President Roosevelt. And when he died in 1953, the momentum, the machinery was in full swing. And after that, it really didn't matter whether you were a Democrat or Republican.
Well, and then, okay, that's the point that I wanted to get at. So you very succinctly said, okay, abolitionist and progressive, maybe Fabian socialist is a good moniker of progressive at this point. You got abolitionist and progressive that both agree that the current system is bad. And by current system, we mean stuff like, freedom and freedom of speech and, the right to your religion, the right to bear arms, the right to a speedy trial, and that states should have a certain amount of, that's our current system. They're like, we hate all that. We want a system where we're in charge and everybody else, like you said, they have the freedom to fight with each other about stuff that we don't care about, but the stuff we do care about, they don't get any say in that whatsoever. Right?
It's like scientists above the rat maze watching the rats fight each other. And the scientist will throw in scraps of things, different kinds of feta cheese, blue cheese, to see how the rats will react. And the goal is to create docile rats.
Right. So Charles Merriam, from my understanding, what he brought to the table is he went, no, don't do the head chop off thing right up front. We can get around this by thousands and thousands of little cuts and little adjustments that happen on the undercurrent. I mean, like you said, he's down in the baggage hold rewiring the plane while everybody else is focused on, whether or not we should or how we're going to
replacing Biden or Trump. Yeah.
Yeah. Or how are we going to either do it or prevent the other side from storming the cockpit, right?
Yes.
So that's the situation that we're in now. And what you're saying is that this guy had so much influence over literal presidents and, getting funding from Rockefellers and all sorts of stuff that the system is now put into place where we have something like the National Governors Association that understands how human survival and tribal instincts work. And they go, I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat. I know how to manipulate you.
They feed their ego. Because there's 50 of them. There's 300 million Americans, and 50 humans were selected by those 300 Americans. So they feed the ego of 50 very powerful human beings.
That have a big ego, or else they likely wouldn't have pushed themselves into that position to begin with, right?
And think about it. They are executives. So they're going to execute. So there's a predominant interest in scientists having a relationship with executives, not legislators, because legislators are more emotional, they're more partisan, there's more conflict, more bias, more debate, right? And so Miriam just figured out how to circumvent that by creating a cloak of non-political science, marrying unbiased bureaucracy. He did this through an organization called the Social Science Research Council and the Public Administration
sounds boring. Like,
Clearinghouse.
who's going to pay attention to that, right? Oh, the social science. Right, perfect cloak.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. It's science. It's natural sciences, and it's objective, and there's no threat here. And he even writes about this in his book called Systematic Politics that he wrote in 1945. There's a whole section on the non-threatening nature of science. And so, it's boring, it's non-threatening, and you don't pay attention to it. Our human nature, we pay attention to the car that crashes. We pay attention to the blood on the side of the road. We pay attention to the fight in the schoolyard. That is our human instinct. So my objective is to train leaders in self-governance who understand their survival instincts. Not saying you get rid of it, it's there. It's how do I navigate it so that I can identify the changes that Charles Merriam made long before I was born. And I am experiencing the fruit of that infrastructure. So what do I do with the fruit? Do I fight the fruit or do I cut the root? And that is a difficult thing for people because your natural instinct is to go fight the fruit. What you see before you. You see the fruit, you don't see the root. And so learning to see the root structure that Merriam created in the New Deal in the 1930s and how it's affecting you now, you have two choices. You can fight the fruits, this problem here and that problem there, and whatever issue you can come up with. Okay? There's thousands of them.
Well, and after you finish, I want to give at least two examples so people can conceptualize.
Or you can go directly to the roots and start chopping the roots, and that tree will die.
So let's give a specific example of this. So back when the most horrible disease that ever hit humankind happened in 2020, it was just this absolutely rare coincidence that all the governors at the same time had this incredible emergency declaration power that seemed to more or less give them legislative authority over their state, and they all just seemed to use it at the same time and did the same things with their powers. Isn't that weird?
It's just a conspiracy theory.
Total conspiracy. And then now, so that's happening over here. And to your point, what was the tribalistic partisan reaction? Oh, we're going to pull our kids out of the school system, right? Which I'm not saying is a bad idea, but we're going to pull our kids out of the school system. We're going to get in teams and then go shopping with all our masks off so no one can, that there's too many of us for them to do anything about. They can't arrest us all or they can't kick us all out. Or we're going to, sue the bonds of the teachers who are trying to enforce these mask mandates or all this sort of stuff. This is reacting to the fruits, like you were saying, right? Whereas 10 years ago, if you were paying attention, or however many years ago, all these laws started getting passed in all the states granting these special emergency powers to all the governors, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, correct me if I'm still not thinking this down deep enough for the actual root. Is solving the problem going after the business which isn't allowing me to shop because I'm not wearing a mask, or is going after the problem going, hey, wait a minute, how do we address the fact that these governors are controlled, or I should say they're not really controlled, they're just influenced because they pump up their ego, by the National Governors Association, and so they're getting directed by the National Governors Association, while at the same time, a long time ago, these powers had been changed when nobody was really looking, right? Maybe if we address those things, we wouldn't have these fruits over here.
And our human instincts are we would we would spend our energy fighting the fruits. So we show up complaining about the lockdowns or whatever.
Right.
And now it's 2024, and the problem itself, the relationship between scientists and executives, that influence cycle has not been disrupted. So even though the pandemic is over, the infrastructure that Miriam created in the New Deal still functions.
Right. All the governors still have those emergency powers. I think. Was there any state that was able to? I know Idaho was pushing it pretty hard, but did any state? No one's actually got
the system. The system that Miriam created is still fully operational. We simply passed through the storm they created to test our response as metaphoric rats. We reacted to the pandemic. They tested the governing's response. They tested the govern's response. They collected their data. And so the machinery was not affected. We empowered them with our data. We responded. This is the key. So you said, like, well, the emergency powers. I'm like, the emergency powers were delegated by the legislature.
Right.
But the influence between the scientist and the bureaucrat is not disrupted. That influence machinery is fully operational in 2024. I'll give you an example. So Social Science Research Council, the boring organization you said earlier, no, not threatening, it only has 70 employees. It's located in New York State, but 70 people have more influence on the empirical, credible, non-political decision-making of bureaucrats and elected officials than probably any other organization on earth. Now, the second organization where local and state bureaucrats go is called the Public Administration Clearinghouse. That's located in Chicago. And so your bureaucrats, city managers, right? The National Planning Association, American Planning Association, Municipal League of Cities, National Association of Counties. Where do they go to get their policies? Well, those two organizations I mentioned before are connected like this. So PACH and SSRC are connected still today. So there's no disconnection. So there's a machinery to process empirical data and produce policy that is called non-political, and it's transferred back to the 35,000 cities, 3,084 counties, and 16,000 school districts in the United States. In the meantime, we don't have that kind of large-scale cooperation because we don't build relationships with our bureaucrats. We literally are we're cockpit stormers. Yeah. We're not systematicians. We're partisans on the left or right side of the plane, fighting each other, and then storming the cockpit every 2 years. In the meantime, Miriam established a machinery, a virus in the plane for self-destruction, and we have, I have ideas and things that I'm working on to compete with that machinery. And it requires people, number one, to to deny their survival instinct, not give it up, deny it. Number two, learn the system. Number three, understand the history of how Miriam built infrastructure that outlasts him. He died in 1953, and it continues to operate, is the point.
Yeah.
So it's not so much about learning history in him, it's about learning the infrastructure, abolition, progressive, converging Miriam infrastructure, and then the virus is released. Now we have 97,000 regional governments because of Miriam. We have 4,105,000 pages of rulemaking from 432 agencies in the federal government because of him. We have 35,000 cities, with 20,000 of them with city manager forms of government because of him. I could just go on and on.
I want to clarify that real quick. So, I mean, first off, we talked about the or you mentioned the PACH, the Public Administrative Clearinghouse, and the SSRC, the Social Science Research Council, that nobody's heard about. They're super boring. And, there's 70 employees at one. I don't know how many are at the other. Small numbers compared to the 300 million people that are in the country, that somehow have influence almost over every single, for example, city in the country, where our whole constitutional system had this idea set up where it's like, okay, all the power is spread out so nobody can jump on and grab all the power. Well, instead of the in quotes abolitionist method of like, okay, we'll just attack it until we get the power, this is no. We're going to make this boring thing in the background and kind of seep into everything. So technically they're all still separated, but they're all coming to us for ideas, like you just said, city manager, which if you haven't heard of a city manager, it's a city manager is essentially the mayor plus in terms of the power that they have, because they kind of sort of have legislative powers, if I'm not mistaken, that's chosen by the city council. The mayor becomes symbolic. That removes the traditional method by which the local residents can select their executive, and it gives them powers that they're not supposed to have. And then because they're all connected to the SSRC and the PACH, I mean, maybe they don't even know they're connected to it, but the information is funneling them. They have a guidebook to say, okay, here are the things that I need to do as a city manager. They don't even realize that they're following this game.
When they turn their policy,
disconnected because they have the city manager system instead of a city mayor system.
When they turn on the policy faucet inside the bureaucratic bathroom, the flow of policy is connected to the utility district of the SSRC and the PACH. So that doesn't mean you turn on your faucet at your house and the water just comes. You don't think about the utility district and what, you know what I mean? You just
the reservoir up on the side of the mountain.
The reservoir, It doesn't matter to you as long as the water is flowing. It's the same human nature for bureaucrats. There's 23 million of them in the United States. There's 200 or so of these employees of these two organizations, and it spreads from there. You have hundreds of government associations from school, city, county, region, state, federal, where the people in those areas come together. They have some kind of cooperation, some issues they deal with, the struggles they have. And behind the scenes, you have these Miriam created utility districts flowing policy called non-political that I argue is not unbiased. It is progressive policy based on the progressive platform of 1912. And they were able to make this case that political science was science, but Miriam was an activist first.
It's objective like physics. If you drop a rock, we can calculate it. It doesn't matter what anybody's opinion is. That's what they mean by unbiased and objective, right? When that's clearly not the case in political science.
They simply are able to point at Republicans and Democrats as partisan, and they're able to point at those associations and the scientific associations as non-political. But I argue that they are cloaks for the Progressive Party's political platform of 1912. Charles Miriam was the architect. President Roosevelt brought him into his administration. They called it the New Deal. And the results are we have 97,000 regional governments, 4,105,000 pages in the Federal Register of Administrative Rules because of Charles Miriam. And it's growing rapidly because the partisans are not They're not paying attention to the plane, they're paying attention to the pilot. Miriam paid attention to the plane and could care less about the pilot as long as he could influence them through association.
Disturbing, yet fascinating. And one of the reasons it's fascinating is I know the Center for Self-Governance is actively working on, like you said, solutions and being able to compete against the Charles Merriam side of the chessboard.
We are.
Now, in previous conversations, and we've recorded those, some of those, we've talked about how important personhood is, and we've talked about how important the concept of parenthood is. There's a third thing that we haven't had a conversation about, which is the importance of statehood. Could you spend some time talking about statehood from the systematic politics perspective?
Yeah. So, from a progressive perspective, the state is divine. They do not believe.
And that's the general concept of state, not like Washington State or New York State. You mean like the concept of state. That's what you mean by the state is divine, right?
The system that manages human relationships.
Okay.
We'll call that the state. In the progressive world, the state is divine. There is no higher power than the state itself.
There's no God. It's just the state.
There's just no higher power other than the state. And that could be God, Allah, butterflies, the environment, solar flares, Big Bang, whatever. In their world, the state is divine. And the starting point for all of their philosophy begins with their view of the self, the human individual self. Some of them, they all believe that there is a self, but there is disagreement within their world over which doctrine of the self you pursue. Now remember, in their world, keep this in mind, the state is divine. They believe that individuals within the state have a self, but there is disagreement over the doctrine of the self. So, for example, the way they define selflessness, so you add the word less to self and ish to self. So their view and definition of selfless and selfish are going to look completely different than, say, a Republican partisan who is conservative leaning patriot versus a Democrat Gen Zer on a college campus supporting Hamas, a foreign terrorist organization. Both of those groups, the college kid and the Republican patriot, both of their definitions of selfless and selfish are going to look completely different than a progressive. And so why is that important to understand? Because the progressives, in my opinion, control the machinery in the baggage compartment of our system, while we are all fighting with the pro-Palestinians and the patriotic Republicans are fighting for control of the cockpit. Their version of selfish and selfless, they see both of those as selfish because their instinct is not governed. They're fighting for control of the plane. The progressive philosophy sees both of them as selfish, ego-driven. Selfless looks like Charles Merriam in their pursuit of the state. He's not out front. He's behind the scenes. He's disciplining his ego, and so he's more concerned about the meaning of words than he is about winning the issue. So the progressive in the state is divine world. Their behavior is going to look like literally trying to fight for the meaning of words. They're not concerned so much about abortion, pro-life, pro-death. That's not a thing for them. Both are considered selfish in their world, so they marginalize that to partisan.
Let,
Let those
and then
people fight.
sorry to interrupt you. Let me be clear that both pro-choice and pro-life are considered selfish because in each case, neither side is saying what's the best for the state. Do I have that
This is
right?
the key.
Yeah.
This is the key. The progressives see the state as divine. The partisans see the state from the perspective of their issue. So they're going to design their state based on their doctrine. The progressive believes the state is already divine. So for them, the issue doesn't matter. For the Democrat and the Republicans who are fighting in the the main cabin, they're fighting. They don't care whether it's a Boeing 747 or a Cessna, as long as they are in charge of the plane.
Mm-hmm.
So their doctrine of state, a Democrat's version of the state may look like a communist, socialist, collectivist, and the Republican patriot was going to look like capitalist, individualist, etc. And so they're going to fight over control of whatever plane is put in front of them. The progressives could care less because they already believe the state is divine. So if you can picture that from a self-governance systematic perspective, partisans are going to fight for whatever system is going to give them control. Progressives aren't going to fight. They're going to make the state divine. So statehood, from a perspective of partisan and systematic, is an incredibly important understanding as you engage, make change in your community, wherever you live, is what is your view of the self? Do you believe you have one? Or do you believe there isn't one and you're just a pile of, chemical reactions? What is your view of the self? Number two, what is higher power to you? Is the individual higher power? Is the state higher power? Is God higher power? What does higher power mean in your mind? It will guide every single policy decision that you fight for. It will determine whether you are competitive with progressives or not. The consequence of your view of the self and how you deal with it is the genesis for all the words that come out of you, all of the actions that you take on a daily basis. So knowing yourself first, how do I see the self? What is higher power to me? And compare that to the other humans that are seizing control of the plane or believe that the plane is already divine and are simply rewiring it in the baggage compartment.
Right. So again, to reiterate what you just mentioned, okay, the tribes are fighting over the socialist communist utopia versus the cutthroat capitalist utopia, and they're over there fighting, and the progressives, not like liberal progressive, but like in Charles Merriam progressive, as we're talking about, they're like, we don't care as long as we're in control of it. Is that a succinct way of describing it, or did I get it
As
off?
long as the post-Civil War progressive abolitionists control the meaning of words, they don't care about setting up whether Hamas supporters set up a blockade in campus and whether the pro-Israelis come and destroy the US UCLA thing. They don't. That is data. As scientists, they're watching the rats fight each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? For them, it's about controlling the meaning of words. And they do that through collecting data, writing the policy, transferring it to the association of bureaucrats who implement it back in their communities.
Well, let's give a concrete example of that. So we've talked about parenthood a lot. Right now, stakeholder is kind of I don't know if it's but what are the big words flying around where the meaning is becoming more and more important, right? Now, are parents the primary stakeholder, or is the state in some sort of capacity the primary stakeholder? And what does stakeholder mean? What flows down from that of the answers to those questions is basically what happens to kids, right? What happens to the relationship between kids and their parents? And one of the things that I've learned from Center for Self-Governance, and we've seen this happen now in at least 3 states coming off the top of my head, is getting the state at the state law level to recognize parents as primary stakeholders over their children's upbringing, because now that we're starting to control the definition of that word, the power flows down from there.
Yes. So one of the words that they create that's not legal but is private and culture, it's more, okay, it's cultural, not legal. So when I say cultural, it's private out there in the public sphere, but it's not legal in the sense that it's in the system.
Mm-hmm.
So think of it as, I say a word like stakeholder. It may not have a legal meaning in the system, the plane, but it may have a cultural meaning inside the main cabin amongst all the partisans.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so the word stakeholder is a progressive term, and it's related to people who have a vested interest in the success of the system.
Right. Or
So,
would it be accurate to say, who do the benefits of the system accrue to? That would be the stakeholder, right?
yes. Yes. Hold on a second here. So the stakeholder is a word that's used culturally, not legally, to define people who have a vested interest in the success of the system. And in the progressive world, they have a vested interest in the success of the system that they are creating through Miriam's infrastructure. So we have to go a little bit deeper into Miriam's religious belief. He believes that the state is divine. And so the state is divine belief originates in 375 BC by a guy named Plato, who writes a book called Republic. And in Republic, the system is called the city-state. The pilots are the philosopher kings. The stewardesses and the baggage handlers are called the guardians, and the rest of us are called the producers. We are selfish, and we're divided into our groups inside the main cabin. And the guardians keep us separate and distinct while protecting the cockpit philosopher kings, who are not elected, but they are especially selected and specially trained from the producers, who are viewed by the guardians as the most objective truth seekers, like Bill Gates or Klaus Schwab, who invented the term stakeholder back in the 70s. Now, when we talk about parenthood, we compare that to their religious belief that the state is divine and their religious text coming from Plato's Republic. We look at what does their policy look like when it comes to children and parents. So book 3, 4, and 5 of Plato's Republic deal with these in various stages. But cutting to the chase, basically, there is no parenthood in the divine state. In Miriam's Republic or Plato's Republic, there's no parenthood. There was a man and a woman who had a sexual relationship. A child was conceived, it was born. The guardians take the child so that the parents don't know the child. Together they raise the child, and then the child is then sifted into future philosopher king or future producer.
Depending whether they were bronze, silver, or gold.
Things like that. Metaphorically, yep. Yes, exactly.
One other point, I read Plato's Republic like 10 years ago, is on top of that, it was wives are to be held in common, so when a woman gives birth to a baby, you can't even know who the father is.
That's correct.
For one more level of disconnect of the parents from the child.
That is correct. There is no parenthood. In other words, there isn't a family unit as we would understand it in the United States, a husband, a wife, a father, and a mother, together, a unit, raised child, go through all those things. No, the child would be raised in the public school system per se. The teachers would be the sifters. The guardians would be the National School Board Association, the Washington State School Directors Association. The administrators would be, and the principals and so on and so forth. They're the primary stakeholders in the success of the child's education. Now, the upbringing is another word. So, stakeholder, separate that, upbringing. So, who is responsible for the child's upbringing? If the state is divine, the conceivers, the birthing mother, right, the birthing father, the conceiving father are not the primary stakeholders in the child's upbringing. The state would be
Because
the
the state's
primary.
divine.
The
Yeah.
state is divine. So the state is the primary stakeholder in the child's upbringing. The public school system is the primary stakeholder in the success of that system of education. Upbringing is way more than just education. It's discipline, health, friendships, and how they spend their
Everything.
time. Everything. It's the
Everything.
whole
Yeah.
everything about them. Okay, so when we think about parenthood as what is your view of the self? How do you see what is divine? Is the individual divine? Is the state divine? Is God divine? Or is the butterflies divine? Is a tree divine? Is nature? I mean, there's about 11 of those things. You have to measure that according to your view of the self and your view of higher power. When you start to think about, well, how do I compete with progressives who believe the state is divine?
Mm-hmm.
And their religious text gives them the playbook on what to do with society. You dissolve the familial bonds. You the child becomes part of that infrastructure that they become blended. Abortion. We tend to think of that as an evil that occurs here in the United States or originates here. It doesn't. It originates in their religious text from 375 BC.
He talks about. I know he talks about abortion in Plato's Republic.
Yeah, up until the age of
if
three.
the population's too big or the state deems it like we got to kill the babies because that's not part of the state's plan to have that many or whatever the exact reason was, right? Then you say it again. It looks like you're responding to a text.
Well, you froze up.
Oh, sorry. So, abortion is talked about in Plato's Republic, and if I remember correctly, the idea is something to the effect of, well, we either need abortion or we don't, depending on what the state needs for its population. Right? The individual right of the baby or the parent or whatever, that's selfish.
Yes.
Right.
And so eugenic supremacy with a view of pure aristocracy, and the tie is state is divine, and the religious text that encompasses that is Plato's Republic. Bringing that to modern times, the fundamental question is over competing for the meaning of words. So there's primary, stakeholder, parents, child, upbringing. To be a part of the systematic chess game of the 21st century, you have to understand you're not so much competing for space on a college campus. You're competing for the meaning of words. Who is the primary stakeholder in a child's upbringing? Is it the parent? Is it the state? Who is it?
Mm-hmm. And then let's bring our partisan politics in here. Well, it's obviously the parents, because that's my opinion on what it should be. Right? As opposed to, okay, well, let's open up the system's handbook, which is the state law, and see who it actually is. And you find that in every state, they've got some, each state has their own way of saying it, but it's something to the effect of the state is the primary stakeholder, right?
This is kind of critical. There is no legal definition in the system for stakeholder. There is, however, cultural definition of stakeholder, which is why it's important for your listeners and other human beings to be a part of the conversation regarding the meaning of words. What does it mean?
Let me emphasize that real quick, because since I've done my business acquisitions, and I'm in the healthcare industry. I don't want to give too many details here on the show about what industry I'm in, but I am connected to a specific state's, governmental updates on what the heck's going on in that industry, and it's constantly this term is thrown around. Hey, we're the healthcare bureaucracy of whatever state. we're having a meeting to address the needs of stakeholders in this area. The stakeholders, they're constantly throwing around the word stakeholder, and we're meeting with stakeholders in order to form the policy. We're doing this with the stakeholders. We're doing that for the stakeholders. It's bizarre, like you said, that there's no legal definition of this, but I'm looking at it in this one, corner of this one state, the word's being thrown around all the time, and it has significant weight to it.
Significant
they're
weight.
making decisions based on what the stakeholders want, or whatever.
So the scientists who are married to the bureaucrats, they use that word in their circles as a internal term to describe that their vested interest in the success of the system as non-political, unbiased, technical installers, quote. And so to be competitive with that in the 21st century, like how do I compete with a dead man's infrastructure that's fully operational? It's important for us to compete for those 5 words: parents, primary, stakeholder, child, upbringing. And so in Washington State, tangible example, initiatives were created using the system as it's designed in Washington, whether I like that part of the system or those buttons or not. We were able to get the citizens who are registered voters to vote on what's called parental rights, but injecting that language as the first sentence. Parents are the primary stakeholder in their child's upbringing. Now, the survival instinct for the parents in Washington State is parent rights. Where's my rights? My rights.
Yep.
Okay. But we were able to put the systematic language in there to compete with the post-Civil War progressive abolition machinery. Their desire is to control the words primary, stakeholder, child's upbringing. We simply added parent to that, and they have to compete with that now. So,
and then to be clear, if you don't know, that passed. Like when it passed, it was 90 days before it becomes law. I don't know if we've passed that 90-day mark or not, but we've definitely passed the point where it's going to happen. Yeah,
no, it is a law now, and what it does is for most parents, they're going to go back because their survival instinct has been assuaged, so they're going to go back to their daily living. For those of us who are focused on the system, those other 5 words are priority number 1 in the coming 2, 3, 4 years. So taking those words and now pushing them down to the 300 school districts, it is state law that parents are the primary stakeholder in their child's upbringing. Are you going to make it policy 4129 or not? It's a question. Are you going to be the schools that are not going to enforce federal law and allow foreign terrorist organizations to be supported by white college students as potential domestic terrorists on domestic soil? Those are legitimate questions. And so it is now state law. So go to your schools and bubble up the policy from the school. What about your city? Your city's gonna be like, we don't have anything to do with kids. Oh, wait a minute. Your kids don't use public playgrounds and public parks and sidewalks and ride on your streets and get hit by cars and have to file insurance claims inside their parents' cars, do you? County governments, oh, we don't involve ourselves in kids. Oh, so you don't have families that are moving in from other states and looking for single family housing, 1 to 10 acre plots, et cetera, do you? Okay.
It's like this cascading waterfall of implications that come down from that core one sentence.
5 words.
From the top. 5 words.
5 words, yes. And you can bubble them back up. Now, remember, there's 16,000 school districts, 35,000 cities, 3,084 counties, and 97,000 regional governments. So across the country, this is a large-scale cooperation effort that requires self-governance regarding survival instincts, a willingness to learn the whole system and not parts of the systems I like, and a willingness to understand the historical ability of the post-Civil War progressives to do this to you from the grave based on their religiosity that the state is divine. And so one competitive pillar is either parents are primary stakeholders in their child's upbringing in this state or they're not. And you want to be a part of that effort, then you can take the state law of Washington now, because there it is, Whoop, there it is. You can take it and go to your schools, the 300 of them in Washington state, and say, hey, this is a state law. You need to make this policy 4129 a part of your policy network statutes within your school board.
Otherwise, you're breaking state law. That's hard to argue against.
It's hard to
Especially
argue
if you're a
against.
bureaucrat, right?
Your cities, this needs to become an ordinance. It's a state law. We need to pass an ordinance. Parents are the primary stakeholders in their child's upbringing in our city. Now you'll be able to identify which cities believe the state is divine, which cities don't.
And then you know where to focus your energy. So I think this is the part where the conversation gets exciting, because it's kind of grim if you don't know the solution on the other end. You're like, oh my God, there's these technocratic overlords that are taking control of everything, and they know our every move, and right? No, that's not what Mark's saying here, and that's not what I'm saying here, is that there's a way to compete with this. First, you have, like you said, you have to stop seeing the partisan politics. So we talked about Washington State. Where else have CSG trained teams gotten parents as primary stakeholders into state law?
So as of 2024, Idaho and North Dakota are the only two other states that have passed parents are primary stakeholders in their child's upbringing laws.
Well, you say only other states, but Washington, Idaho, and North Dakota are three more than the zero that it was because nobody was paying attention to it, right?
That's correct.
I think it's important to point out, particularly for North Dakota, I'm going to get him back on, Cole Christensen, who is the representative who got this through the state legislature. I mean, not literally single-handedly, but kind of single-handedly. He was just a CSG student. He was the one who took the training and took it upon himself to do this thing. And I think it goes back to what you said before. If we could get people, up, first of all, getting out of this partisan politics mindset and suppressing their survival instinct, 28 people can do way more than 5,000 who are just grunts.
Absolutely.
On the front lines, right?
Without a question, when they understand themselves and their survival instincts, and when they understand the system and how it's being modified by whom, and they're not alive. It's their infrastructure, right. The words that keep it going. And that's kind of the critical thing with the description of Cole. Now, Cole has moved to Missouri, and he is married to a state representative, and so.
So we should see Missouri coming up anytime now.
I would agree 100%. Is that Cole, as Generation Z, the second youngest elected representative in North Dakota history, was trainable, malleable. His opinions about the worldview, it was easy for him to set that aside so that he could see the idea of Miriam and his view of the divine state based on the religious text of Plato's Republic. Mm-hmm. That was easy for him. Now it's harder for older generations because I'm not saying stuck in their ways. It's just that, how do you say it? It's harder to teach new strategy when survival instincts,
doing an old strategy for 40 years or whatever,
and their survival instincts are at play, are fully engaged.
What I wanted to emphasize there was, you said it's only 3, but I said, wow, holy crap, it is 3, because with just a small number of players, 3 state laws for this very centralized issue from the progressive standpoint have been adjusted. He's now spreading theoretically to Missouri. This is totally within reach, is the point that I want to say. We just need some dedicated teams of 3 to 28 people in a couple right locations.
Trained leaders in self-governance who understand their survival instincts and how to navigate that. Number 2, trained systematicians who understand the entire structure of government from federal down to school. Whether they like it or not, they understand how it's designed right now. Because obviously they have their opinions and they have their survival instincts, how to self-govern those, learn the system how it is now, and then who made the modification machinery before they were born, and is that machinery still operating, What is our strategy to deal with that? Those people are what we're looking for in Center for Self-Governance. Now, I want to make it really clear that CSG is an educational institution to teach leadership in self-governance and practitioners of systematic politics. We are forming 2 additional organizations that will deal with the structural changes in the policy in the coming months. Matter of fact, one of those associations is having its first meeting on Monday, and our graduates of our organization will have the choice to go work at that institution in order to draft policies that compete with scientists who hide under the cloak of non-politics by passing their empirical data and policy to bureaucrats in that kind of baggage compartment world.
Mark, I want to be respectful of your time, so tell me if we've gone too long and we don't really have enough time to explore this idea. So when it comes to parenthood, one of the ways of securing our ability for self-governance is, let's get parents as primary stakeholders passed at various levels, state law being obviously a huge one. What are some strategies and tactics for addressing whether or not the state is divine, understanding the definition of statehood?
So parenthood is obviously one of those. Because if the state is divine, then parenthood doesn't exist in their world. So their policies are going to look like that. Parents are terrorists. Parents are threats. Trespass them from the schools. Transition their kids without their input. It's all of that's going to look like that. That's one example. Another example is regarding the definition of personhood. And this is related to humanity as a whole. Again, under my theory that progressives want to control the meaning of words, and if they control that, then they control everything as a pure aristocracy. In their world, they would be above humanity. And those below will be less than humanity. And so when we look at the word personhood and what does it mean, you'll start to see, for example, in Washington State, the collaboration between organizations that believe that non-human entities should have rights, like water, animals, nature, etc. So the Rights of Nature Project in Spokane, or the Non-Human Rights Project of Spokane, collaborating with similar nonprofit organizations in Olympia, the capital city of Washington, and driving initiatives in the future to change the meaning of the word person in the Constitution of Washington State. The reason they see that is because they believe that state is divine and that the humans that are selfish are equal to animals, nature, artificial intelligence, and that in their world...
Go ahead.
In their world, they are the guardians of the law above that inferiority, and to make all of those equal would require them to control the meaning of personhood. What does it mean to be human? What is a human right versus an animal right versus a natural right versus an environmental right versus an artificial intelligent right?
So, because I know the way that the environmentalists spin it is that we're bringing up the rights, the dignity of the Great Salt Lake or the Columbia River or whatever, right? But in reality, as you just pointed out, what they're doing is they're pushing down the rights of the human to make it equal with that of nature, which is nothing, right? It's just a rock. It doesn't have any rights. And I would guess practically what this turns into is that, I mean, if nature has rights, if you're driving and a bug splatters your window, did you just commit murder? And if you just committed murder, who's going to prosecute you?
There's definitely the policies. Once you understand the progressive religion of divine state, philosopher king, Plato's Republic text, all that, it gives you a perspective of what their potential policies will look like in the future. That is an advantage because you can predict what they're going to do in the future. Does it make sense? So
Right.
rather than
Well,
always
they're the lab rat.
yeah, literally, there is a picture that I use with my students that shows, I'm just a rat in their science maze, and it says, while the scientists are saying, well, we were studying the rats were studying them, and unlike ours, their study gets published. That's going to happen in our world. We are we have to understand that we took for granted parenthood and personhood. We took for granted that humans
Because it's given to
are
us from
apex.
God, and it's our right, and it doesn't matter what you write down on a piece of paper. It doesn't change that. Well,
and this is the key: is that the
maybe
progressives
philosophically,
believe
right,
in
but yeah.
progressives believe in controlling the meaning of words now, not the words from the past. We people that tend to think of our system as something that we should be in control of, and that the state is not divine, we would argue about the words from the past. And I would encourage your audience, we need to understand the past, but more importantly, we need to understand the lexicon of your opponent in the present and be able to use those words to your advantage to be competitive in the 21st century. Otherwise, they are living in the future, you are living in the past, and you can't win.
Right. Well, and then, I mean, I think that's a nicer way to say it. I think a better way to say it might be they're living in reality and you're living in a fantasy. Right? This is the way that things should be. Well, that's a fantasy. Versus this is the way things are. How do I manipulate them? That's reality.
Well,
so you're automatically at a disadvantage because you're trying to operate on fantasy world and they're operating on the actual chessboard of what's happening right now.
That's correct. They're controlling the meaning of words by studying your reactions, not based on what you should do according to old words, what you will do according to current situation. So when they implement the pandemic policy, and there's a pandemic that pops up, the governors are simply implementing the policy handed to them from the bureaucratic association, where the empirical data and the study was arranged by things like SSRC and PACH. And they're simply waiting to see how everybody responds, how the governors respond, how the legislature responds, how you respond, how the Democrats respond, what the businesses, the hospitals. Then they take all that data scientifically and rewrite the policy for the next pandemic. Issue it to the National Governors Association, and then it's distributed to the governors. And that's how they change the system. I have no idea how to make it any simpler than that. But
that's pretty simple.
It's that entire machinery is designed by Charles Merriam back in the 30s under the New Deal. He crafted it based on his religious text of Plato's Republic. He was trained at Columbia University, where most of the pro-Hamas foreign terrorist organization support is occurring right now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So strategically, it comes down to the meaning of words and who's competing with them. You can fight for the Republican platform or the Democrat platform, and your elected officials are still going to be influenced by Miriam's machinery. And you're going to wonder why they're changing. They were so good at the convention. They were so whatever your religion is. And then they change. And I'm like, well,
he promised that he would do X, but he did Y. Yeah.
I've been cheated on by my boyfriend. And I'm like, it's the same story, same drama, same days of our lives, hourglass. The key is understand yourself, your survival instincts, learn to be self-governing in that realm, study the system in its entirety, not the way you want it to be, the way it is absolutely occurring now. That's how the progressives make their change. And then they find out how it's working now, and then they inject either the crisis or the whatever. People react, they study, they rewrite the policy, and they gradually, incrementally change the system without bloodshed.
So if someone is listening to this and they say, I want to learn how to become a systematic politician, a leader in systematic politics, someone who understands the whole system, what's their first step to getting that learning and training?
Well, our organization is highly focused on this pathway. And first two classes I recommend that they take from CSG is a history of partisan politics and the bottom line civics of what is politics. Those two classes are a combined total of 6 hours, 2 hours in the history class, 4 hours in the bottom line civics. And what they're doing is we're giving them a historical flow of the creation of partisan politics in the United States and an introduction very gently into systematic politics. Bottom line civics is giving people a basic understanding of politics in its definitional stage. What does that mean? We have this negative connotation that politics is a Lyme disease that you need a vaccine for. You should wear a mask and 6 foot social distance and not talk about at the dinner table. This is absolutely inaccurate when it comes to being a human. You and I are practicing it now. We're using words plus expression to expand our influence. You're doing it to expand your audience. I'm doing it we do this all day. But we tend to think of it as Joe Biden or Donald Trump, and we don't want to be a part of that. It's a huge mistake not to press into what you consider to be something sucky. So bottom line civics is shifting that paradigm regarding politics and gently introducing them to systematic politics. The second set of classes I recommend is our structure of government classes. Every structure of government, we provide a 2-hour class, school. How does it work? How do you find it? Where's the glove box? Where's the manual? How does this thing work? Learn how it works. City government, 2 hours, county, region, state.
And in this one,
and then third,
you will open up and look at the actual person's city or the actual person's state and say, here's a specific system, as opposed to being like, okay, in general, here's
how
it, yeah.
No, this is how it works where you live. This
Yes.
is how to find the information regarding your city government and your school government and your county government. And each of those levels of government are separate structures. And so I'd recommend that as a second set of classes. The third set is our Leadership in Systematic Politics series. That training is to teach you how to compete systematically and how to do it at an advanced level. There are 3 blocks. Each of them are 2 hours, 2 to 3 hours. There are training exercises, and they have to be done in sequence. Some people prefer to start back at the beginning, the history and the bottom line civics. Some people prefer to go straight to the structure because they're just highly focused on schools. And some people will jump straight to the leadership. Just whatever works for your audience, whatever's best for them, and wherever they feel the most comfortable.
Absolutely. And so where do they go to find that?
centerforselfgovernance.com. They can reach out to our staff who will gladly help them set up online or in-person classes. We have some classes that are pre-recorded. Most of our leadership classes and structure classes require a live instruction, whether it's webinar or in person. Cost-wise, it's extremely it's nothing like
It's really
having
cheap.
to get a college mortgage.
You're not going to be $100,000 in debt after you get some teaching from Mark.
No, you're going to pay $25 for a 2-hour class, and that's for our nonprofit. I don't get paid. My instructors don't get paid. We have a nonprofit, so our goal is to empower people to self-govern, practice systematic politics, so they can compete with Charles Merriam's Marble Cake Factory.
And if you do go to the website, don't look at like the classes coming up and go, oh, well, they're not coming to my neck of the woods. Those classes are there because somebody called and said, come to my neck of the woods, and then they put the class up. So
yeah, give us a call, set it
send
up.
them an email, give them a call going, I want to set something up. And that's what puts the class up there. Don't get the cart and the horse backwards on that one.
We're not an organization that has a minimum class requirement. Just remember Tiananmen Square, it took one guy with 2 grocery bags to stop 180 tanks. We're interested in one person who's willing to govern the self and their survival instincts, to learn the whole system regardless of how they like it or don't, and then to identify who's making these changes into the system over the course of their lives, and then to learn a skill set, competitive systematic politics skill set that will empower them to be very successful politically, whether they're elected or not in the 21st century.
Heck yeah. Well, Mark Herr, thanks again for your time. It's been, I don't know, we're going for about an hour and a half now. And like I said, I know you're busy, so I really appreciate the time that you've taken out of your day. And this has been Dylan Moore with Irida TV, which you could find at irida.tv. And go get some systematic politics training, because I've taken some myself. I guarantee you will feel a lot better at playing the political chessboard afterwards than you are beforehand. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.